All right, let's get started. So, welcome everybody. Thank you again for joining us this morning on our class for the intertestament period. So this is session 2, and one of the things, just a brief review of Zoom, is that again, like I mentioned before, I disabled the video this time mostly for recording purposes. So hopefully that the recording will just be the slides and not like jump back and forth on the video part. But so hopefully that will go a little bit better on the recording side. But there's also a chat feature in Zoom. So if you want to chat, go ahead and do that. If you guys have questions, you can try and do that. I'll try and kind of monitor it here and there. But also there, a better way if you want to, jump in. And I want to try and make this as interactive as we can. But there is a raise your hand feature in Zoom. So if you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have something that you want to share, if you want to answer a question, go ahead and raise your hand. And then one of the things that if you look at all the participants, we're all kind of muted for now. So so if you raise your hand, unmute yourself, and then share whatever you want to share, and then go back and mute yourself after. The main thing is because to kind of take out the background noise. All right. So again, welcome everybody. I know some other people joined via phone. Not exactly sure who that is, but so this is our session 2 of the intertestament period, and just a brief course overview. Okay, so introduction, review of the Old Testament, right, and which we covered last time, and also the diaspora and the Persian Empire. So today we're gonna kind of hit the Greek Empire and Hellenism, and so next session we'll kind of hit on the Hasmonean period, the rise of the Roman Empire, and touch on the Apocrypha and different writings that kind of happened during this intertestament time. Okay, goals for this class: build connection, right? Connect the Old and the New Testament. But also connect God's story and ours. Because sometimes I think we just go, oh, that's stuff that happened like thousands of years ago. And, that's great. But we don't make that connection of how that relates to each one of us. And hopefully as we go through this class, that we'll gain an appreciation of God and through history and through how he shaped history. So, like I brought up before, to me, it's like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And hopefully today we'll see how a couple more pieces of that puzzle fits in to all of the things that we're familiar with, and where that fits in with Bible and also with God's story. So, references, as I pointed out the last time, but I'll throw it up here as well. So a lot of information that I got was from these 2 books and also various different Bible commentaries. So feel free to go back yourself to, go through that. Okay, brief review. Okay, what are some of the paradigm shifts that God brought about through the diaspora and the Persians, and why? You guys remember? I was talking about a paradigm shift. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Destroyed the temple. He
Okay.
which was their center of worship.
Mm-hmm. So
Brought
what
in.
happened once the temple was destroyed?
Well, they thought God had left them, because to them the temple was where God was with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as far as their religion, I mean, so there's one part of it. They felt like, oh, God had left them, right? And for the most part, most of the Jews were still trying to practice Judaism. So when their focus from the temple got taken away, what did they end up focusing on instead?
More national views or individual views?
Yeah, that's one of the things that happened as they got dispersed. Their nation also got destroyed. The king got deposed, right? Their land got taken away. And all of a sudden, it helped shift their view from just seeing them as a nation and looking at their collective piety and focus more on the individual piety, right? Well, what else? Anybody else can remember some of the things that we looked at the last time? So when God took away the temple, what did they end up focusing on in order to continue to practice their religion?
Prophets and law.
Prophets and law. Very good. So they shifted their focus from temple to the scriptures. So, some of the things to think about, but the whole point is just to really try to understand what God was doing at that time. And this is some of the things that we looked at the last time, right? Pre-exile and post-exile, and what God was trying to do in preparing them for the coming of his son, the Messiah, and also for the coming of his kingdom, right? And if you look at that, collective piety, looking at them as a whole versus individual piety, that was, something where, for us as Christians, as disciples, our focus is on a personal relationship with God. And so God was preparing them to have a shift in how they saw their faith, right? From a collective, as a whole, as a people, to individual faith, right? Participation in the ritual ceremony shifted to personal morals and ethics. When the temple got taken away, they focused more on the scriptures, the law and the prophets. Professional priestly positions gave way to lay scholar teachers, and that's why we see like teachers of law and scribes and rabbis, right? Worship of the temple became more teaching of the law in the synagogues, and also as one of the things that God was doing was helping them to try and see not just the physical realm of things, but a spiritual realm. Okay, so that's a paradigm shift. One other thing I wanted to mention as I bring up this map is that part of the diaspora, where the Jews got dispersed throughout the different, Babylonian, Assyrian empires, is that they built these synagogues, and if you look at it, it actually really helped the spread of Christianity. If you look at the different dots, those are recorded congregations of the first century. It also shows where the Jews got dispersed, and where they got dispersed, they start building a lot of different synagogues, right? And the synagogues is where they kept the Old Testament manuscripts. And back in those days, when you were a Christian, you didn't have a New Testament yet. So the things that you had to rely on were the Old Testament scriptures, right? And that's one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through. But if you look at the New Testament, you see that the Christians, the early Christians, were actually trying to convince the Jews about Jesus through the Old Testament. It's not like they had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John with them. It's not like they had the book of Hebrews or the book of Romans, and so they have to rely on the Old Testament scriptures. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next session when we kind of touch a little bit on the Apocrypha. Okay, so the big picture, all right? Jeremiah 29, verse 11 to 13, it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in the future. Then you call on me, and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." In Acts 17, verse 26 to 27, "From one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as some of our own poets have said, we are his offspring." Okay, so from these two passages, what does God desire for us? What is God's heart? What does God want? Go ahead, anybody. Hopefully you guys are out there listening. The challenges of the online meetings, right? Sometimes, are they listening? Are you guys there? Anybody?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
This is Emily. He wants us to find him and seek him and love him and trust him. Oh, can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you're just asking, what does God want from us from the scriptures? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So to find him and seek him and to hopefully have a relationship with him one day and to trust him.
Yeah, exactly. And that's pretty awesome that's God's heart, right? As he goes, as we, sets up the different boundaries, the different nations and everything, that his desire is for us to seek him and find him, for us to be able to have a relationship with him. And I think it's important for us to keep that big picture in mind, because otherwise, we just kind of gain knowledge and information. And that's one of the things I really want us to remember as we go through this. And in Ephesians 1, verse 4 and 5, it says, "For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will." So, I mean, that just blows my mind away, that he chose us before the creation of the world, that he was thinking of us. And as we go through, these sessions, to realize that even events are like thousands of years removed from us, that he was thinking of us as he was shaping history. Awesome. All right. So let's jump right into the Greek Empire and Hellenism. So this kind of gives you a breakdown of the different time periods from the Jewish perspective. So mainly we're going to be in the book of Daniel, and specifically Daniel chapter 11 today. So, like I mentioned the last time, Daniel is the only book in the New Testament that actually, in the Old Testament, that references this time period. So, if you have your Bibles, turn to Daniel chapter 11. But just to give you a little background on the book of Daniel, okay, he was around sometime between 605 BC during Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Nebuchadnezzar was the Babylonian king at that time, who actually destroyed the temple and took Daniel as one of the captives from Jerusalem. He was around to about 537 BC under the reign of Cyrus, when the Medes and the Persians took over and conquered the Babylonians. Okay, so Daniel 11 actually dates from the events that we're going to be reading about, dates from about 530 BC on through the mid-2nd century BC. So you're looking at things that are about, going through the history about 400 years later. And what's interesting is that his prophecies are so detailed. And as we go through it, you'll be like, wow, okay. That a lot of scholars claim that it was written at a later date. They actually think that it was written during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes in 167 BC, when he heavily persecuted the Jews who were in Jerusalem. The problem with that, and so a lot of people actually thought that for a while, until they found Dead Sea Scrolls. And we'll touch a little bit on the Dead Sea Scrolls at the next session as well. But manuscripts of Daniel were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the people who actually copied the Dead Sea Scrolls and wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were from that Qumran community. So what they found is that, hey, these guys actually considered Daniel, the book of Daniel, as canon. And it kind of proved that Daniel was actually written before this time, because the Qumran community got established before that later date that they claim that the book of Daniel was written. So I have a link there from BibleArchaeology.org about what they found from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but sort of disproves their later date in that sense. The point that I want to bring out is sort of God's sovereignty, right? In Isaiah 44, and I'll just read verse 8. It says, "Do not tremble, do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim this and foretell it long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? No, there is no other rock. I know not one." And at some point, we just have to go have faith that God is able to do what he's able to do. And he used Daniel to prophesy these different events that were about to happen. And Daniel covers quite a bit of the intertestament period. Okay, so just to let you guys know ahead of time, the stuff that we're going to go through today is going to be quite a bit sort of historical in nature. So hopefully I don't put you guys to sleep, but hopefully as we go through it, you can keep in mind that, it's pretty amazing what God is doing. And even as he's predicting the things, Daniel's predicting the things that's happening or is about to happen, pretty amazing. Okay, so Daniel 11 verse 2, it says, "Now then, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will rise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece." Okay, so the 3 more kings, the current one being Cyrus, are Cambyses, Gamada, and Darius. And that's their dates. And the fourth king would be King Xerxes. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit more. But those are the kings that Daniel is talking about. So we're going to go into, again, this is a map that I showed you last time, the Persian Empire. And, there's Greece on the far west of that map, far left. So the Greco-Persian War, just like Daniel 2 says that, he's going to stir up people against Greece. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I just wanted to add, when you brought up Isaiah 44, that part of the issue that we highlighted earlier for Israel was the temple was destroyed. They're no longer in the promised land. God has left us. We see in Isaiah 44 and in Daniel that the prophets are trying to explain to the people, are trying to teach the people that God is still with them, that God, our creator, is using even other nations to discipline them, that everything under creation is in God's control. And so there, in those later chapters of Isaiah, we see Isaiah pointing out that God is using Cyrus to come and free them. Cyrus isn't the Messiah, but he's being used by God, even if Cyrus doesn't even know it.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. So I'm sure this is, you've learned quite a lot on the book of Isaiah, right, from your classes that you're doing. Okay, so the Greco-Persian War. Okay, so the Persians, obviously, they were bent on expanding their empire, and Greece was one of those areas that they thought, hey, maybe we can go over there and take over. So Greece was made up of separate city-states. So it wasn't like one kingdom. It was different ones. You had some of the major ones. You had Athens, Corinth, Megara, Sparta, and Thebes, right? So when the Persians actually expanded their empire, they ended up conquering some of the Greek colonies that were in the western coast of Asia Minor, which would be Turkey today. So this whole conflict between the Greeks and the Persians begins in 499 BC, when some of those Greek colonies decided to rebel against the Persians, and with the help of the Athenians, who were kind of like on the eastern coast of the Greek Isles. So, here's a brief look at that. So Athens was kind of one of those naval, military powers during that time. And when some of the colonies on the western coast of the Persian Empire rebelled, they asked the Athenians to come and help them as their fellow Greeks, and which they did. So obviously that didn't go too well because the rebellion got quelled pretty quickly. But this gave Darius, just the right amount of excuse to say, hey, let's focus our attention on Greece. And after conquering Egypt, they figured, Greece is just a bunch of separate city-states. They're always fighting against each other. Piece of cake, right? So he mounts a fleet of about 600 ships and sends a big, large army. They land in Marathon, and this is in 490 BC under Darius I. And they are met by a small army of Athenians, who through some pretty incredible strategy were able to defeat them, and basically, they had to retreat back to Persia. So legend has it that after their victory in Marathon, one of the messengers ran from Marathon to Athens to tell the Athenian king, hey, we won, and thus we get our term today, Marathon, because the distance between Marathon and Athens is about 26 miles or so. All right, just a little side trivia if you guys want to know where Marathon came from. That's kind of where it came from. But so the war wasn't over because Xerxes, the fourth king that Daniel talked about, would actually mount another larger army 10 years later and begin his invasion. And he actually sent a army overland, and he also sent a army over the sea. And this is where we get the 300, right? For those of you guys who seen that movie or whatever, you got the battle at Thermopylae. So where a small band of about 300 Spartans fought to death and delayed the Persians long enough for the Athenians to evacuate Athens. So that was under King Leonidas. And, you know, it's pretty amazing. But because of what they did, the Athenians were able to basically evacuate, and Xerxes marched on with his armies to Athens and found an empty city. Wasn't very satisfying, but he did conquer Athens. But the Athenians, who were exiled, persuaded the other city Greek states to unite against Xerxes. And in 479, with the united force of the Greeks, they were able to defeat Xerxes and his army and drive them off the Greek peninsula. Okay, so that actually ended their Persian ambition of expanding their empire in the West. Okay, so again, here's a map of, you know, the different, that Greco-Persian war. And, you know, if you look at it, you know, you can kind of take a look at it yourself in your time when I send the slides out. But if you look at that dark black lines going through, you see that Xerxes sent an army going all the way around, marching around the north to come down into the Greek peninsula. And he also sent a naval, you know, contingency to fight and you know, kind of fight them on both sides. So basically, you know, that war ended, and we get into Daniel 11, verse 3 and 4. It says, then a mighty king will arise who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. Verse 4, it says, after he has arisen, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the four winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others. Okay, the reference of this mighty king is none other than Alexander the Great, which he was ruled from 336 to 323 BC. All right, so we'll get into a little bit into the rise of the Greek Empire. Okay, so after the Greco-Persian War, Athens basically emerged as the dominant leader of the city-states. That didn't last very long because Sparta and its allies decided, hey, you know, we don't want to just be under you guys and be dictated by what you want us to do and have to pay taxes or tributes or whatever. So then Sparta and its allies rose up to fight Athens and its allies in the Peloponnesian War. Sparta comes out victorious. After that, there's more infighting among the Greek city-states, and, you know, they got pretty depleted and weakened by all these different infighting. And in 338, Philip of Macedon conquered all and united all of Greece and became the king of the Greece kingdom, I guess, the Greek kingdom. It's interesting because actually the Greeks looked at the Macedonians as a semi-barbarian group. They didn't really consider them fully Greek, even though Philip and his royal family claimed Greek descent. But regardless, they really didn't stand too much against Philip, and he conquered all of Greece. His son was Alexander, and who was tutored by a great philosopher Aristotle, who is considered of Western philosophy. Okay, Aristotle was Plato's pupil, who in turn had studied under Socrates. So for you guys who are into philosophy and philosophers who have read stuff about them in Psychology 101 or whatever in college or whatnot, if you're into that, that's kind of the connection, right, between Alexander and the Greeks and Hellenism and all the different philosophers. Okay, so Philip didn't last too long. He was assassinated in 336 BC, and Alexander took over at the age of 20. He actually proved to be a very capable leader and a very capable military commander. By 332 BC, he moved through Syria and Palestine and then into Egypt. He had an army of about 40,000. So it's pretty amazing the things that he was able to accomplish with such a small force in what he did in the next several years. But one other thing about Alexander was he was a master of propaganda. Okay, so he didn't come marching in and says, "Hey, I'm gonna conquer you." He says, I'm here to liberate you. I'm here to liberate you from those, oppressive Persian rulers and their oppressive taxes, and all these different things. So he actually didn't really meet a lot of resistance from the locals. The locals actually welcomed him because they said, okay, we weren't really Persian to begin with, so awesome. If a guy coming in to free us, great. So he was able to actually do a lot of things because of that, and also because the Persian Empire at that time was under Darius III, who was not a very competent emperor. So, little side note: during his stay in Egypt, Samaria revolted, and he actually, with the help of from the Jews, destroyed the city of Samaria, rebuilt it as a Greek settlement, and gave some of the Samaritan towns to the Jewish territory and called it Judea. So some of the things as we look at Judea from the New Testament period, that's sort of the source of where it came from. Okay. Alexander continued on and defeated Darius III and was declared king of the Persian Empire. He pushed on through Afghanistan all the way to India, where finally his army said, you know what, enough. We're tired. We just want to go home. And so even as much as Alexander tried to plead with them and beg them, they said no. So Alexander just said, okay, fine. So he returns to Persia in 326 and pursue his dream of basically spreading Hellenism and merging the East and the West together. However, in 323 BC, at the age of 32, his kingdom was thrown into chaos because he died suddenly. We don't really know exactly what the causes of his death, but he was survived by one son who was too young to rule, and who was soon murdered, his empire got basically divided to his various different generals. Real brief, again, this is a map of Alexander and his conquest. So I know it's kind of small and everything, but it kind of gives you an idea of what he went through, and amazing just to see what he accomplished in that short amount of time. But if you look at it, he actually didn't have that many battles, like I said earlier. You know, he was able to just march on through, and people were just like, hey, all right, let's overthrow the Persian rulers and we'll be subject under you. So that sort of, you know, different things will happen with Alexander the Great. Okay, another side note, Alexander and the Jews, the interaction between Alexander and the Jews is recorded in the Talmud, and also in Josephus, who was a Jewish historian of the first century, in his Book of Antiquities. So in their records, basically, the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem, fearing that Alexander would basically come and destroy the city, decides to, you know, I'm going to go out there and meet him before he gets to the city. So as he came out, Alexander saw him and met him and actually dismounted and bowed to him, which is you know, I guess he's never done that before. So his general, Parmerio, asked him, why'd you do that? Alexander basically told him, hey, you know, in a dream, I saw this very person in this very apparel, right? All the priestly robes. And so who knows, you know, like divine providence, God was intervening. So Alexander actually granted the Jews much freedom, and Judea and Jerusalem was relatively untouched by all of this, by all his conquests. You know, again, a little side note with the Samaria rebelling and the Jews helping Alexander, obviously that didn't, you know, help their relations, which was already strained when the kingdom of Israel split north and south, right? So that kind of added a little bit more fuel to, you know, their racial tension between the Jews and the Samaritans, which we see later on in the New Testament. And the next session during the Hasmonean era will see that escalated even more. Okay, so Daniel 11, verse 5. You guys still with me? Like I said, this content is a lot of history in it. So through as you know, quickly as I can. But Daniel 11:5 says, the king of the south will become strong. One of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. Oh, hey, that must be a song, I'm thinking. Okay, Daniel 11:5. So out of the different generals that divided his kingdom, Alexander the Great's kingdom, two kind of emerged, you know, as the main powers through that time. There was a bit of infighting among the different generals and control of the empire. Art's still awake. Awesome. So, you know, the two that came out was Ptolemy in the south, who controlled Egypt and Palestine, and Seleucus, who was the king of the north, as referenced by Daniel, who controlled Syria and Mesopotamia. Now, what's interesting is that Seleucus actually served as a general under Ptolemy as they were fighting against Antigonus. So, you know, I'll show you a map here. This is kind of where things landed after all the different generals were fighting against each other. Antigonus actually was probably more powerful, but because of the different alliances between Ptolemy and Seleucus, they were able to defeat Antigonus. But this is sort of where things fell. And Palestine actually ended up under the Ptolemaic kingdom. Okay, so Daniel 11:6. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance. But she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she'll be betrayed together with her royal escort and her father and the one who supported her. Okay. This is in reference to 250 BC. Ptolemy II gave his daughter Berenice in marriage to form allegiance with Antiochus II. So in order to do that, Antiochus had to divorce his wife, Laodice, and disinherited their two sons. Obviously, that didn't go very well with Laodice, who 2 years later poisoned Antiochus II and murdered Berenice and her son. So, like I said, you know, these different things that Daniel writes and predicts is pretty detailed. That's why a lot of scholars are like, are you sure this was written like hundreds of years before this happened? Anyway, so that's sort of what happened. And we jump to Daniel 11, verse 7 and 8. One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years, he will leave the king of the north alone. Okay, so Ptolemy II died before his daughter Berenice was murdered. So Ptolemy III, who took over, rose to avenge his sister and successfully invaded Syria, or the Seleucid kingdom, from 246 to 241 BC. He wasn't that ambitious, so he went, beat them, and stayed a little bit, but decided, you know what, I'm just going to take all the loot and go back to Egypt. So he takes all that loot, and as referenced by Daniel, he actually takes back, and from history, is that he takes back the sacred Egyptian idols that was taken by the Persians in 524 BC when Persia conquered Egypt. So because he returned with these sacred idols, he was received with much love from the local Egyptians. Essentially, the Ptolemies become Egypt, right? So, you know, when we see people like Cleopatra and later on, they're actually kind of Greek that merged with the Egyptians. So the Egyptians that we see are actually, you know, Egyptians, not the Egyptians of the Old Testament per se, but it was sort of, it ended up being this mix, right? Seleucus II, one of Laodice's sons, gained control of the Seleucid kingdom after Ptolemy III left. All right, Daniel 11, verse 9 to 13. It says, then the king of the north will invade the realm of the kingdom of great army, which will like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south will march out in rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. When the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands. Yet he will not remain triumphant. For the king of the north will muster another army larger than the first, and after several years, he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. Okay, you know, so Daniel keeps going with these prophecies between the fighting between the Seleucid and Ptolemy kingdom. Okay, so Seleucus II decides to invade Egypt, but is unsuccessful. He turns his attention to Asia Minor and actually ends up being murdered. Antiochus III, who took over after him, raised a huge army and marched against Ptolemy IV and is defeated at the Battle of Raphia. This is another one of those famous historical battles that is recorded. If you guys ever wanted to look that up, you had an army with Asian elephants fighting an army with African elephants. Anyway, pretty interesting if you guys are into that. So a brief thing, Jews under Ptolemy rule. Okay, Ptolemy began to practice tax collection on the local official, practice that encouraged extortion by those collecting. So the tax collectors, the local tax collectors, were responsible for meeting a quota. Anything above that they gave to, the Ptolemies would help them gain political favor. Anything that they kept for themselves obviously was for personal gain. The Ptolemies actually originally gave that responsibility to the Jewish high priest, and also gave the high priest the title of being the governor of that Judea and to oversee civilian affairs. This practice continued on in the New Testament times, right? So when we think about tax collectors in the New Testament, okay, who can name 2 tax collectors in the New Testament? Matthew is one. Who's the other ones?
Zacchaeus.
Yes, Sana. Zacchaeus. Very good. Yeah, and what happened to these 2 tax collectors? What is that?
Both turned to God.
Yeah, both turned to God, right? They both became disciples of Jesus, and Matthew or Levi actually got chosen as one of Jesus's apostles, right? And yeah, like Dave mentioned in his chat, that these tax collectors were pretty much hated by the people. What does that show us about God's heart? Is that Sana raising hand again? My awesome wife?
It's Samuel.
Samuel. Go ahead, Sam.
He wants a relationship with everyone. He wants a relationship with everyone.
Yeah, he wants a relationship with everyone. So I think one of the things that we see is that God is trying to break down barriers, right? Whether it's social, economical, whether it's, whatever. He's trying to break that down. And we'll look at that a little bit more. Okay, going back to Daniel 11, we'll continue on with Daniel's prophecies of this time. Verse 14, it says, in those times, many will rise against the kingdom of the south. Those who are violent among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps or capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist. Even the best troops will not have the strength to stand. The invader will do as he pleases. No one will be able to stand against them. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have power to destroy it. He will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an allegiance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. Then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more. Okay, so verses 14 to 19. pro-Seleucid faction led by the Jewish high priest Onias II, basically wanted the Seleucids to win. Unfortunate for him, the Seleucids lost, and Ptolemy IV wasn't too happy about that. So he removed him from having that civil authority, but allowed him to actually retain the high priesthood. So he didn't go as far as removing him from the high priesthood, but basically took away any of these, as a governor. He was no longer governor. He gave that to Joseph, who was from the Tobiah family. Okay, the very ones who opposed Nehemiah when he was rebuilding the walls around Jerusalem. Okay, so it's pretty interesting, right? So now you got, the Tobiah family kind of getting in the mix of all the different things going on. Ptolemy IV died and left his throne to his 6-year-old son, Ptolemy V, who ruled from 204 to 180. Okay, seizing the opportunity now that the Ptolemaic kingdom is under a 6-year-old kid, Antiochus III launched the 5th Syrian War, and this time was victorious and added Palestine under his control. So as we talked about the Jews under Ptolemy rule, now all of that is going to change. And understand that, Palestine and Jerusalem was located as a border between the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemy kingdom. So it was a pretty strategic territory, and also one for commerce. Okay, as we go on in this passage, the Romans were gaining power, and Antiochus decided, I need a little bit of stability because, this fighting between me and the Ptolemaic kingdom is draining my resources. So he decides, hey, I'm going to establish an alliance with the Ptolemies. And so he sends his daughter, Cleopatra, to be Ptolemy V's bride. And, Cleopatra is the one that kind of gets in the mix with the Romans and all that, Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, and so on and so forth. So this is the actual Cleopatra. She actually was part of the Syrian kingdom, and she ends up being sent to Egypt. And, basically she's like, okay, whatever royalties I had towards my dad and his people, I have better chances of being more. She was pretty ambitious, right? So she thought, hey, I can do a lot more things if I just fully royal to the Egyptians. Okay. So what happened after that is that, Antiochus decides, okay, I'm going to focus more on fighting the Romans and keep them out of Asia Minor, which he lost under, the Romans under the commander Scipio at Thermopylae, the same pass where the Greeks and the Persians were fighting, and had to negotiate for terms of surrender. One of the terms was that he would send his son Antiochus IV to Rome as hostage. Okay, so Daniel 11:20. We keep going in Daniel. His successor will send out tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. Okay, so Seleucus IV succeeds him and has a relatively peaceful reign. The tax collector refers to one of his chief officials, Heliodorus. Seleucus IV was actually assassinated in a plot by Heliodorus, and some suspect in collusion with Antiochus IV, who was the one who was sent to Rome. So, okay, so Daniel 11:21 to 22. It says, he will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him. Both it and the prince of the covenant will be destroyed. Okay, so that contemptible person was Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes meaning God manifest. The people didn't really like him much and actually called him Epimanes, which is madman. Okay, so like it says here, his throne wasn't supposed to go to him. The throne wasn't supposed to go to him. It was supposed to go to Seleucus' son, Demetrius, but who was still a minor. So Antiochus Epiphanes actually sets up this co-regency with his nephew, who ends up conveniently being murdered a few years later. Okay, so basically, he ends up, Antiochus Epiphanes ends up taking over the throne. Now, one interesting thing that it talks about here is the Prince of the Covenant, referring to Onias III, the high priest. Okay, so Onias III, so one of the things about Antiochus Epiphanes is that he was really bent on spreading Hellenism throughout his kingdom. Onias III was conservative, a conservative Jew and high priest, and was pretty opposed to this whole concept of Hellenization. So in 174 BC, a coalition of Jewish aristocrats and some priests, and possibly funded by the Tobias, decides to approach Antiochus to replace him with his brother Jason. They end up paying Antiochus a large sum of money, and Jason, Onias' brother, promised Antiochus that he would build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Okay, we'll look at that a little bit, but building a gymnasium is a prelude to transforming Jerusalem into a Greek city or Greek polis. So Onias III was deposed. According to 2 Maccabees, Onias III was actually murdered later on in 171 BC. Okay, so Jason and those who support him set a bad precedent. Traditionally, that position fell to the eldest son of the high priest, but Jason, basically used money to buy that position. A little bit later, the Tobias thought, hey, if we can do that, let's try something else. So they took this even further and bribed Antiochus to replace Jason with Menelaus. So Antiochus, who saw the money, said, sure. So all of a sudden, the priesthood left those who were in the lineage of Aaron and of the priest Zadok, who was one of the ones that returned as a remnant to rebuild Jerusalem. Menelaus was cruel and capricious tyrant, and he was the one who had Onias III assassinated. Pretty interesting, right? So we get to see some of the things that are going on through this time, and the politics within Judea and among the Jews. Okay, Daniel 11, 29-35, it says, at the appointed time he will invade the south, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. He will turn back and vent his fury against the holy covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the holy covenant. His armed forces will rise to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. With flattery, he will corrupt those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him. Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword, or will be burned or captured or plundered. When they fall, they will receive a little help, and many who are not sincere will join them. Some of the wise will stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made spotless until the time of the end. For it will still come at the appointed time. Okay. In 170 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes starts another campaign against Egypt and actually succeeds in placing Egypt under his control. 2 years later, the Ptolemies decided, you know what, forget that. So they declared independence, and a second campaign ensued. This time, however, the Roman Senate decided, you know what, the Seleucid kingdom is trying to spread its influence and power a bit more, so we're going to put a stop to that. So they send a general, Publius Laenus, to intercept Antiochus. When the general met him, he actually shamed Antiochus into relenting, because Antiochus knew he did not have enough power to stand against the Roman Republic. So, according to some historical writings, this general actually went and asked him, "Hey, the Roman Senate says stop. We don't want you to go invade Egypt." And Antiochus said, "Hey, let me think about that." So the general drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said, "You have all the time you want, but I will need an answer from you before you step out of the circle." So you have a general standing up against the king. And again, Antiochus, knowing that he would not be able to stand against the Roman Republic, relented. But he was pretty upset. So in his anger and humiliation, he turned all his frustrations on Judea. So in 167 BC, he sent an army to Jerusalem to transform the temple into a shrine to Zeus. He massacred many of its residents, burned down homes, destroyed buildings, destroyed the wall around Jerusalem that was built by Nehemiah. He erected a fortress called the Acra in the location where Solomon's palace was. And in the inner sanctuary, he erected an idol of Zeus and also replaced the altar with a pagan altar where they offered unclean animals to Greek gods. So this is what Daniel was talking about, the abomination that causes desolation. In verse 32, sorry. Okay, I don't know who that is, but okay, so so even those Jews who were actually wanted the Hellenization and thought that was a pretty good thing for them, whether it's their commerce or power or so, what Antiochus did really offended them, where they were like, I don't know, maybe that's not such a great idea. But anyway, verse 32 kind of talks about a reference of those who would rise up against him, which is the Maccabean revolt. So we'll get into that in our next session. So what I wanted to do, and here's a chart of the different kings under the Ptolemy and the Seleucid kingdom, and gives you kind of the dates and who kind of takes over and so on and so forth. Okay, so just something as a reference for all of us. Okay, Jews under the Seleucids. And again, the control of Jerusalem and Palestine fell to the Seleucid Empire. Seleucids ran their government quite different. But the Ptolemaic kings were content as long as they received their taxes. The Seleucids, especially on the Antiochus, wanted to spread Alexander's dream of spreading Hellenism. So, as we saw, there was a power struggle over the control of the temple between the high priest, the Jews, the Tobiah family, and the different factions within the Jews, right? And so it started actually under Ptolemy, but it escalates under the Seleucids. So like I said, the Ptolemy set up where the high priest was responsible for the taxes, collecting the taxes. And so a lot of money was flowing through the temple. And control of the temple meant that they would control the money and thus control power. And that's why the position of high priest, or control of the high priest, became this source of struggle, right? So, here's a question for you guys. John 2, what did Jesus accuse those in control and in authority of the temple? What did he accuse them of, and why? You guys remember John 2, what Jesus did? He went to the temple. David says robbing and I'm thinking oppressing the people. He called them turning God's house into a market. Yeah. Into a den of robbers in some of the versions that it says. Yeah, very good. So, as you see, this continues on in the New Testament, right? The whole control of the temple and what the people were doing, and using the sacrificing for atoning sins as a ways of making money, right? The money exchangers for the people, the Jews coming in from all these different nations, they would exchange obviously for profit, and they would sell the different animals for them to sacrifice, since they had such a long trek to make it to Jerusalem, right? So instead of bringing monies, instead of bringing animals to sacrifice, they would bring monies and buy the animals to sacrifice in the temple. So they use that whole thing as a ways of making money. Okay, so I want to try and touch briefly on Hellenism, because with the pressure of trying to accept Hellenism, Judaism and Hellenism will come to a head. Okay, so just a little bit to understand. It's very hard to describe Hellenism because it's kind of like a whole way of life, a way of thinking. From our perspective as Christians, some of it is good, some of it is bad. All right, so we'll take a look at that. And because Antiochus Epiphanes was really zealous about spreading Hellenism, it really accelerated things. So just to give us an understanding, Alexander, when he went with his armies to conquer different places, he was accompanied by architects, city planners, literary figures, philosophers, biologists, botanists, musicians, and actors. Pretty funny composition of those who traveled with his army. And part of this because he wanted to spread that Greek culture from the way of thinking, from the way people dressed, right? Their lifestyles, their style of living, city plans, architecture, language, entertainment, forms of government, right? He was trying to influence them on thinking about having different priorities, values, ways of problem solving, religion, philosophy, norms of behavior. So it's really hard to kind of nail down what Hellenism is. And from Hellenism of the Greeks and Hellenism later, when Alexander went into the East and conquered Persia, it started becoming more of a hybrid, right? So, it's pretty interesting because even though the Romans later would conquer the Greeks actually conquered them culturally. So the Greek culture continued on even after the Romans took over. So just to give you a little bit more, the Greek polis is a city. Some significant, building structures of the Greek city is the agora, the marketplace, and the theater, and lastly, gymnasium, right? So, Acts 17, verse 16 through 18, it talks about how when Paul goes to Athens, he is out there, and in verse 17, it says, so he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and Greek-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. So Paul would actually go into the agora or the marketplace and start sharing his faith. And what's interesting about the agora is it wasn't just a place of commerce, but it was also a place where common people got together, met, and got news of what was going around the world from those traveling through, right? So that was sort of their form of getting their news, right? As they kind of gathered and hung out at the marketplace. In the theater, it's also mentioned in Acts chapter 19. And you can look that up as well, but people were in an uproar and in Ephesus, and they seized this guy Gaius and Aristarchus, who was Paul's traveling companions, and they rushed them to the theater, and they wanted to, kill them, and so on and so forth. So that's another reference to a Greek building. Gymnasium we'll get into a little bit. When I went to Ephesus in 2013, here's a picture of the theater at Ephesus. It was a pretty magnificent structure. So pretty awesome to actually be there and see it live. So it wasn't like this small little theater that they, a few seats here and there. I mean, this was like big. Right? But it was a big part of spreading that Greek culture and Hellenism. So, gymnasium. Okay, this is not in the New Testament, but it's actually it's more important than the other two buildings. It was sort of the center of the Greek culture. It was a place of learning. So it wasn't just a place where you go and exercise. It was actually, they would set up like an academy within that gymnasium where they would come and meet and learn and be educated. Okay, it was also a place to conduct business. So a lot of the Greeks, to close out deals, they would go, hey, let's go meet at the gymnasium. That's a cool place, right? It was also, a place for exercise and training for competitors in the public games. And for the Greeks, athletic competitions were often a prerequisite for social advancement. So little note, the Greek, from gymnasium, the Greek word is gymnos, which actually means naked. Okay, so the Greeks held highly the human body, right? So they revered the human body, and so all their competitions were done in the nude. This actually was not too cool for the Jews. If you guys remember some of the Old Testament stories about Noah and Adam and Eve and being ashamed, right? So they associated being naked with shame. And maybe that's why the Christians, you don't see Paul and his companions going, hey, let's go to the gymnasium and let's go share our faith. Maybe that wasn't the best thing. Maybe that's why we don't really see gymnasiums, recorded in the New Testament. Also, circumcision, which the Greeks felt like it was pretty offensive because you're doing something to your natural body. So circumcision actually precluded the Jews from participating in any of the athletic games and things. For some of the Jews who really wanted to conform, whether it's for advancement or prestige or whatever, they would actually undergo a procedure called epipasm, which is an operation to reverse circumcision. Anyway, I'll spare you the details, but needless to say, it wasn't a very painless procedure. So, there's all these influence and pressure for the Jews to convert to Hellenism. This wasn't just between Greeks and the Jews. This also was within the Jews, right? That's why you get like Hebraic Jews and Hellenistic Jews, or Jews of the diaspora versus Jews who were living in Judea. But even within those who were living in Judea, there are groups that really saw Hellenism as an opportunity. One, whether it's to sort of conform to what the rest of the world thought was cool, and probably also gave them better advantages in advancing in their positions, right? So there's that faction of those who wanted Hellenism and those who actually were fighting to preserve their way of life. This is something that comes up in the New Testament, in Acts 6. If you guys remember that, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through it, but it dealt with the distribution of benevolence to widows. Obviously, the Hebraic Jewish widows somehow were receiving more from benevolence than those who were from a Hellenistic Jewish background. How did the church deal with this? They actually appointed, 7 men who were of the Hellenistic Jewish background, sort of into a leadership position. And I think, one of the things that, like I said before, God is trying to break down barriers, right? And Colossians 3 and Galatians 3 really talk about that. Colossians says there's no Gentile or Jew, circumcised, uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave, or free. But Christ is in all and is in all. Galatians 3, it talks about there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. So you see there, God is trying to break down barriers. Awesome. Looks like Emily had to go. Okay. So God is trying to break down barriers, right? Even gender barriers. So, it's pretty neat to see what God is trying to do. Another thing, when you think about Hellenism, you think about, well, why? What is God trying to do through this? Sana, did you want to say something? Okay. So why Hellenism? What is God doing? One of the other things about Hellenism, which I think is kind of interesting, is in Acts 17, when Paul was in Athens, right? He was out in the marketplace. You guys remember who actually, there's 2 groups of philosophers that came and started to have a debate with him. You guys remember who those 2 groups were? Acts 17, verse 18.
Epicurean and Stoic philosophers?
Yes, very good. Epicureans and Stoics. Okay, so one of the things with Hellenism is all these different guys and their thoughts and on philosophy. The Epicureans teaches this is kind of a very very simplified version of what this philosophy is, but teaches that basically a man is miserable because he desires things, so that he doesn't need to desire. So if he can get into a habit of desiring only the things that we need, like basic needs, food, shelter, clothing, whatever, then we'll be happy. The Stoics were more about living according to nature, and their nature was sort of these two levels. There was the outward and the visible, and the breath or spirit. And another Greek word for that would be logos, right? Again, a very oversimplified, basically that they taught virtue is the only good thing. External things like wealth, health, pleasure, and so forth are neither good nor bad, but as quote unquote material for virtue to act upon. So their philosophy is that a person's philosophy is not what the person says, but how the person behaves. There were other schools of philosophy like the skeptics and the academics, and I don't really have time to go into that, and I didn't have time actually to study through all of that stuff. But Hellenistic outlook is more of a universal and syncretistic. And what I mean by syncretistic is it tries to combine and merge different viewpoints and different thoughts, right? So they actually had a pretty open mind to sit and listen to other points of view, to debate their own points of view. And if it appealed to their reasoning, they would go, okay, let me accept that. And if you go back to Paul and some of his speeches that are recorded in the book of Acts, and also some of his writings of the New Testament writers, you actually kind of see them using Hellenism in a way as an advantage to reach out to those around them, whether Jews or Greeks or Gentiles. Okay. So again, this is what I was talking about, philosophy, right? I wanted to point out, so this is Acts 17, verse 18 to 21. And verse 18, it says, a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. Verse 21, all the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. Wouldn't that be awesome? You start talking about Jesus and they go, hey, we'd like to hear some more. I mean, imagine if evangelism was like that today. But in a lot of ways, because of Hellenism, that's what these guys wanted to know. They actually wanted to hear more and try to understand. So pretty neat. Okay, Hellenism versus Judaism. Okay, this is just kind of brief condensed comparison, right? Economy was more urban, Judaism was more rural, agricultural, religion, polytheistic versus monotheistic, religious outlook, metaphysical, speculative, pagan, and secular versus ethical and practical. On the national outlook, like I said, is universal syncretistic. Judaism was more on the side of being isolationism, right? So basically, they were trying to keep it within, stay faithful, keep our ways of life within instead of trying to spread it and to everybody else around them. So this is one of the things that I think God was trying to do. Okay, so the good from Hellenism, common language, the Koine Greek, was spoken throughout the Greek Empire, also by the common people, which is very important. Not just the aristocrats or those in power, those who were educated, well educated, but the common people spoke Koine Greek. This actually kept going throughout most of the Roman Empire. It was universal and syncretistic, right? Versus Judaism was trying to maintain faith within, not spreading faith without. And some of the philosophies and debates opened up people's minds to consider Christianity. What do these aspects of Christianity, do these help? Pretty obvious, right? Evangelism. So God's dream, Jesus' dream, was to spread the gospel to all nations, right? We have 1 Timothy 2, where it says, God wants all men to be saved. And we all know the Great Commission, which is talking about, go, right, into all these nations and baptize them and teach them. So God was actually trying to prepare the Jews and sort of like in that paradigm shift, right? That because God began his kingdom with the Jews, he wanted them to think about, just like Alexander did, that he wanted to spread the gospel to the whole world. And this wasn't just something that happened in the New Testament. You can look at Genesis 18:18, where God says, hey, you know what? All nations will be blessed through you, meaning referring to Abraham. That's always been God's vision. It was just, he was building that up, all right? So real quick as we wrap up, another important lesson for us to really learn from this is not to conform to the patterns of this world. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. 1 John 2 talks about not loving the world. Judges 3:4, it talks about how God left different people within the promised land to test the Israelites, to see whether they would obey him. And I think that was another thing that God was doing through Hellenism, is that he was trying to help them not to conform. So briefly, the takeaways for us, what is our heart towards sharing our faith to those around us? How's your evangelism, reaching out to people? Being all things to all men, like Paul, yet staying separate from the world, right? Not conforming to the patterns of this world. All right, so that wraps it up. Thank you so much. I guess this time we kind of went through that whole hour and a half. But again, I appreciate everybody being on and, going through the history of the Greek and going through that in the book of Daniel, which is pretty fascinating, just the amount of details that we have. If anybody have any questions, feel free. If you have time, I'm here. So if you have questions or comments or anything, feel free to say that. Otherwise, thank you, everybody. So yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you don't have time, feel free also just to shoot me an email and if you have any questions. All right, awesome. Well, that wraps it up, and let me just close out with a brief prayer. Father, thank you so much for just giving us a time to, just dive into Daniel chapter 11. It's amazing just to see the amount of detail that you gave Daniel to foretelling of what was to come with the Greek Empire and, what happened after that. Truly an amazing thing. And we're grateful because we know that you are sovereign. And through all of this, you had us in your mind. You had us in your heart as you were preparing the world for the coming of your son, Jesus, and the coming of the kingdom. Thank you so much for your love. Thank you so much for just being the God that you are. Like you said, there's no other. Thank you. And we pray that as we continue to learn, that it will touch our hearts and help us to feel the love that you have for us, and help us to build an appreciation of what you have done through history. Thank you. We love you. Pray in Son's name. Amen. All right. Thank you, everybody.